How terrorism affects politics.
After my channel got hacked, I decided not to re-upload this video because of the T-word, but it's now relevant more than ever. I made this video before the French elections, after the French terrorist attacks. I'll talk about more recent events at the end.
With the French elections coming up and the recent police shootings in France, many have suggested that these terrorist attacks will affect the election outcome. But how will it do that? Will voters ignore the terrorism, vote for the party most against it, or, as in the case with the Joe Cox killing before Brexit, react almost in political disagreement with any use of the terrorist incident as political ammunition? Before I get properly into this video, I'd like to say that this video is not made to glorify or condone terrorism. Terrorism is sickening and abhorrent, and quite frankly shouldn't happen, but as we know, it does. In terms of politics, there are three main areas a politician can react. Number 1, condemning the attack. Number 2, showing solidarity, attending ceremonies, etc. And number 3, heightening security levels, bringing in new policy. Policy can fall into three areas: crime prevention, immigration, and foreign policy. How to prevent terrorism. Over the years, politicians have come up with all sorts of policies to prevent terrorism. You can negotiate with terrorists, as in the Good Friday Agreement. You can hack their phones, as with the Snoopers Charter in the UK. You can put bollards up and arm the police, as has happened in multiple tourist areas since 9/11. You can not allow laptops on planes, as has recently happened in the UK and America. Policy that prevents terrorism can either be viewed as invasive or necessary, depending on the public attitude. The frequency of terrorist incidents in France will make the French public see any policy which prevents terrorism necessary. The best way is to restrict access to potential weapons, but as we know, it's easier to get a gun in France than it is in the UK, and even that doesn't prevent vehicle terrorism. Another way of preventing foreign terrorism is by locking off your border, as America tried to do with the 7 mainly Muslim countries. France, though, is within the Schengen area, so we need to leave it or leave the European Union to control this. With homegrown Islamic terrorism, though, it's difficult to see how this can stop it entirely. Perhaps you introduce burqa bans, make your country hostile or even unwelcoming of that religion. But that has the potential of inciting racism and even making potential terrorists more angry. With home policy, terrorism makes people more divided. Politicians claim that terrorism won't divide the nation, but look at the reaction to the Nice attacks. One memorial of flowers,
The other memorial of people spitting on rubbish.
Do you risk seeming racist, or do you take a more consolidatory view and risk being seen as a terrorist sympathiser? The French public are more than fed up by now of Islamic terrorism, and most likely just want to see it stopped, however it can be. The last way of stopping terrorism is by invading the country it might come from. So for example, when 9/11 happened, the US invaded Iraq because the terrorists were from Saudi Arabia. Wait a minute. The US has also recently dropped a massive bomb on the ISIS base in Afghanistan. With this comes great risk. Destabilizing the country, making the country's government hate you, making allies of the country hate you, and making more potential terrorist refugees to deal with at your border. But it makes way for potentially destroying the finances, communications, and overall appeal of the organisation that's inciting the terrorism. The French are most likely aware of all of this, and the winner will be the one party with the most effective plan. The policies that prevent terrorism, controlling immigration, crime prevention, and invading other countries, are all relatively more right-wing than the left-wing alternative of promoting religious plurality, anti-racism, and anti-war. With ongoing terrorism, it's likely the French public will disregard, perhaps even distrust, those default messages of solidarity that come after each and every terrorist attack. So you might think France will vote against the establishment and towards the right. But when Joe Cox was killed before the Brexit vote by a white man quoting Britain First, the British public chose to ignore it and didn't care if their vote would cause more similar incidents or less. They voted with their gut. That's what I hope happens in France.
And I was right. Macron won and Le Pen lost. Voters rejected any kind of notion that terrorism was going to make them more right-wing and essentially just ignored it and voted on their gut. So in addition to the strategies that are mentioned in this video, there are obviously more UK relevant strategies such as the prevent strategy, which can be controversial because if somebody is a strong believer and follows their faith quite radically, then they could be interpreted as being a terrorist when in actual fact they're just interpreting their religion and following their faith. And then in the UK, when we have a terrorist attack, it will almost certainly be followed by an emergency COBRA meeting, which is like a security meeting that the Prime Minister invokes. Now, coming under the banner of crime prevention, we have a terror threat level of critical, which means an attack is imminent, and we have Operation Tempora, which is basically allowing soldiers to be out on the streets to help police. So how will the parties react to the Manchester event? Well, all parties have shown a degree of mourning and condemnation. The party that's mourned the least and just got on with campaigning is UKIP. Labour can use the terrorism on two fronts. Number one, they can attack the Conservatives, cuts to the police force, and blame that as a crime prevention that's not working. And then Corbyn is already blaming the Blairite government and the Conservative government for foreign policy that's not working. The Conservatives can do things like justifying their snoopers charter, and there's talk of them bringing in new laws in order to be able to punish terrorists and deport terrorists. No talk yet of what those laws will be. The Lib Dems, on the other hand, want to scrap the event and they want to redefine the Conservatives' snoopers charter. Then you've got the prominent example of UKIP's policy to ban the burqa. Most of all, what I'm expecting to happen, as with the French election, as with Brexit, is that the voters will largely ignore all party political infighting over the terrorism and dismiss it as simply using the terrorism for party political gain. And therefore, the terrorism itself will be ignored as part of the election. What's most apparent though is the way the media gets us to feel shock, anger, sadness and drama to sell their story and make terrorism into a much larger narrative than what it really is. And so the debates that surround those articles and news tend to be very angry and divisive, while communities outside the Muslim world seem to have a massive lack of understanding about what really goes on within the mosques. And people are caught between two camps of distrust the Muslims or feel sorry for them because it's only a handful of crazy people's fault. I think the best way is by taking away weapons and communication and making it seem less glamorous, but at the same time remembering its victims. But those are big swooping generalization comments. So what do you think the best way of preventing terrorism is? And how do you think we should do it? Let me know in the comments and join in the debate below.